You're already speeding. So is the car in front of you, but you feel it anyway. That flicker of irritation, that pressure to pass, that irrational sense that you're being held back. And suddenly, you're in it. Not a traffic jam, but a psychological negotiation over who gets to be in front. But what are we really chasing when we need to be first?
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
You don't have to be in a rush to feel rushed. Sometimes all it takes is a car in front of you, going the speed limit, minding its business, and yet your body tenses. You feel that flicker of pressure, like something about this is off. You're already going fast, but suddenly it's not fast enough. Not because of time, not because of distance, but because you're not the one in front. That's the part we rarely admit. What bothers us most isn't always the speed, it's the placement. It's that someone else is ahead of us, and something about that hits a nerve. It's not just driving. It happens in line at the grocery store, when two people are walking toward the cashier and the other person gets there first. And you feel that internal spike, even if it only delayed you by 2 seconds. You feel it in the airport boarding zone, when someone inches ahead during the group call, even if it doesn't change where you'll sit. You feel it when another car pulls into the parking space you were hovering near, and suddenly it's not just a space, it's a stolen opportunity. None of these things are life-altering, but they feel personal. They feel like violations, even though they're not. And that tells us something important. It's not about the event. It's about what it represents. Being second, even in small, irrelevant contexts, can trigger something primal. A subtle but powerful sense of being diminished, dismissed, one step behind. For some people, that feeling is intolerable. This is the psychology of status sensitivity. It doesn't just show up in boardrooms or social media feeds, it shows up in parking lots, on sidewalks, at checkout counters. The more we rely on our position to validate our worth, the more we treat every ordinary moment as a competition. The car in front of you becomes a symbol. So does the person who got called into the meeting before you, the coworker who replies to the group thread a little faster than you, or the friend who tells the story first. It's not always about ego in the grandiose sense. Sometimes it's just discomfort. The discomfort of not being the one who leads. The fear of being overlooked. The quiet panic that if you're not ahead, you're behind. And if you're behind, maybe you don't matter. That belief is so deeply embedded in our culture, we barely notice it anymore. We've normalized it. We tell kids to raise their hands faster. We reward the first to finish. We chase being early adopters, first movers, top picks. Even in things that don't require urgency, we create it, just so we can feel like we're doing better than someone else. So when you feel that spike behind the wheel, or in line, or in conversation, it's not about traffic or timing. It's about the internal script that says, I need to be first, because if I'm not first, I might disappear. That script doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a lifetime of being told that visibility equals value, that leadership is dominance, that being seen first is the same as being seen best. And for a lot of people, that becomes a compulsion. Not an ambition, not a strategy, a compulsion. A psychological reflex to assert position, even when it makes no sense. This is what makes the need to pass so much bigger than driving. It's not just a reaction, it's a worldview. Because in a culture built on scarcity and speed, being second doesn't feel like a neutral position. It feels like losing. Being first isn't just about pride. For many people, it feels like survival. At a biological level, being ahead often meant being safe. The person who led the group saw danger coming. The one at the front of the pack had options: more space, more visibility, more freedom to move. Being behind meant vulnerability. You had to react to what someone else did. You had to wait for their signal. You didn't get to choose the pace.
That instinct hasn't left us. Even when we're not in danger, even when we're in a climate-controlled vehicle on a paved road with a GPS, the nervous system still responds to position as if it's about safety. And so, the car in front of you doesn't just occupy space, it occupies authority. It controls your next move. It dictates your timing. And for a lot of people, that's psychologically unbearable.
That's what we're really talking about when we say someone has control issues. What we mean is that the loss of autonomy, the feeling of being boxed in, or slowed down, or forced to wait, triggers a deeper sense of panic than the situation actually calls for. So when someone speeds up to pass you, when they swerve around and cut in, even when they gain nothing, they're not always being aggressive in the traditional sense. Sometimes they're trying to restore their internal balance. The balance that says, I'm the one in charge of me. I choose the pace. I won't be confined. In their mind, they're not racing you. They're trying to rescue themselves from the anxiety of feeling powerless. And that anxiety is everywhere. It shows up in the person who refuses to let a call go to voicemail because they need to be the one responding. It shows up in the parent who micromanages their child's college applications, not because they don't trust the kid, but because letting go feels like falling behind. It shows up in the person who interrupts constantly in conversation, not to be rude, but because being quiet for too long makes them feel invisible. In all these cases, being first isn't about status in the classic sense. It's about safety. It's about emotional equilibrium. It's about regaining the illusion of control in a world that constantly reminds us how little of it we actually have. And that illusion is powerful, because for a moment, just a moment, being ahead tricks the brain into thinking, I'm not behind in life. I'm not failing. I'm not forgotten. That's why so many people crave momentum. Not because they love movement, but because stillness feels dangerous. Because to stop, or to be second, or to be passed, feels like proof that the world is moving on without you. So you pass the car, you take the first slot, you finish the sentence before the other person can, and for a few seconds you breathe easier.
But it doesn't last. Because it's not really about the position. It's about what you fear it means.
That fear is what keeps the need to be first alive. Not ego, not arrogance, but the quiet terror that if someone else gets there before you, there won't be anything left for you. And that belief, that's the one worth examining. When we talk about the need to be first, it's easy to picture it as ambition, someone who's driven, assertive, maybe even competitive in a healthy way. But that's not what we're talking about here. This isn't the psychology of excellence. It's the psychology of urgency without purpose. And beneath it, there's often something much more fragile. It's not about power in the strong, steady sense. It's about power as a defense mechanism, power as overcorrection. The truth is, people who constantly need to pass, interrupt, or dominate small spaces are rarely operating from confidence. They're often operating from threat, from an internal baseline that says, if I'm not asserting myself, I'll be forgotten. If I'm not seen first, I won't be seen at all. That's what makes this ego so delicate. It's loud, but it's not stable. It has to keep proving itself over and over again, because deep down, it doesn't actually believe it matters unless it's winning. And when you're living from that place, even neutral things feel like challenges. Someone walking slightly ahead of you on the sidewalk? You speed up. A coworker responds to the email thread before you do? You get irritated.
Another driver merges smoothly in front of you without asking? You tailgate just a little. Just enough to show you noticed. None of these behaviors make sense on their own. But when you look at them together, you start to see a pattern. An inability to tolerate the feeling of being second, or sidelined, or momentarily irrelevant.
It's not about logistics, it's about emotional placement. People don't need to be everywhere first because they're organized. They need it because they're afraid of what being second says about them. And that fear, left unexamined, creates a long trail of unnecessary tension, not just on the road, but in offices, in families, in friendships. You see it in the person who insists their idea was better, in the boss who undercuts someone else's success, in the friend who never lets you finish a story without steering it back to themselves.
It's not always malicious, but it's always about regulation.
The fragile ego doesn't know how to self-soothe, so it grabs for proof. It passes you, not because it needs to, but because it needs to feel like it matters, like it's winning, like it's not being left behind.
And if that proof doesn't come quickly, if no one notices, or thanks them, or acknowledges their place in line, they get agitated, they become impatient, they find a way to reassert their position, because for that kind of ego, stillness is a threat. Quiet is a threat. Being unnoticed is unbearable.
That's what makes so many of these behaviors look like aggression when they're really something else. They're not expressions of confidence. They're expressions of panic, of need, of a self that doesn't yet know how to feel worthy unless it's visibly in control. And so it climbs and passes and pushes, not because it's strong, but because it's scared. There's a cost to needing to be first, not just to other people, but to you. At first, it feels like a survival skill, like you're staying sharp, staying ahead, staying in control. But over time, that constant pressure to win, to lead, to dominate, to outpace, starts to hollow you out. It makes everything feel like a competition. Even things that are supposed to be collaborative, even things that are supposed to be fun. You walk into a meeting and instead of listening, you're scanning for the moment you can speak. You go to dinner with friends and instead of relaxing, you're comparing where you are in life to where they are. You drive through town, not even realizing you're watching who has the newer car, the nicer house, the busier schedule.
And the worst part is, it never ends. Because the ego that needs to win is insatiable. It doesn't stop when you pass the car, or when you get the promotion, or when you finally make it to the front of the line.
It just finds another benchmark, another person to outpace, another small way to prove I'm not behind, I'm not invisible, I'm still important. But that cycle is exhausting. And it's isolating. Because people start to feel it. The way you interrupt, the way you undercut, the way you always have to one-up someone else's story. It chips away at connection. It turns relationships into silent contests. It makes presence feel transactional. And ironically, the more you push to be seen, the harder it becomes for people to actually connect with you. Because what they see isn't calm, steady self-assurance. What they see is grasping, fragility, the tension of someone who can't rest unless they're ahead of someone else. That's the emotional cost. You might win the moment, but you lose the grounding. You lose the peace that comes from being okay, even when someone else is doing well, even when someone else gets there first. And that loss doesn't just show up in your mind, it shows up in your body, the clenched jaw, the shallow breath, the adrenaline that spikes every time someone gets in your way. Over time, your nervous system starts treating daily life like a race. And every obstacle, even imagined ones, start to feel like threats. That's how people become aggressive in small spaces. They're not mean, they're maxed out. Their system is so used to being in survival mode that they no longer know how to tolerate not being first. Not because they want to win, but because they don't know who they are if they don't. But here's what's almost never talked about. Real power doesn't behave that way. Real power doesn't rush to prove itself. It doesn't get flustered by being second. It doesn't need to dominate small moments just to feel visible. Real power is quiet. It's patient. It's unbothered. Because it's not performing. It's not reacting. It's grounded. And that's the difference. The person who always needs to win isn't operating from power. They're operating from panic. They don't want to be first because they're confident. They want to be first because it's the only place they know how to breathe.
But here's the truth. No one breathes better at the front of the line. Breathing doesn't come from position. It comes from perspective. And that perspective only comes when we stop treating every moment like a test of our worth.
Let's imagine something different for a moment. You're driving. There's a car in front of you. You don't pass it. You stay there. Maybe you ease back just a little. You let the distance grow. And instead of feeling tense or behind, you feel clear, steady. You let go of the idea that you have somewhere more important to be. And you realize you're fine. You're still moving. You're still you. That's not just a driving choice. That's an identity shift. Because every time you resist the need to be first, you are doing more than slowing down. You are undoing conditioning. You are telling your nervous system, we don't need to dominate this moment to be okay. We don't need to win to be worthy. We can be second. We can be still. And we'll still matter. That kind of regulation isn't natural. It's learned, and unlearned, and learned again. Because most of us were raised in systems that made value conditional, that taught us to associate worth with speed, success, visibility, volume. And so the moment we feel second, or late, or overlooked, our bodies react like we're losing oxygen. But you're not. You're just not first. And that doesn't mean you're nothing. In fact, some of the most emotionally grounded people you'll ever meet are the ones who don't need to be first. They let others speak. They let someone else merge. They wait. They breathe. Not because they're passive, but because they don't confuse urgency with importance. They don't confuse domination with presence. They know how to be, not just how to win. And in a culture like ours, that's rare. It's subversive. It's powerful. Because it means your self-worth isn't attached to placement anymore. It's not up for negotiation based on who got there before you. And that's what emotional maturity actually looks like.
Not winning more gracefully,
but letting go of the idea that everything is a contest in the first place. So here's a question worth sitting with. What would happen to your life if you stopped trying to get ahead of everyone else? Would you lose momentum, or would you finally feel calm? Would you fall behind, or would you finally feel free? Because if you're always trying to be first, on the road, in your relationships, in your self-worth, you will spend your entire life chasing a position that was never meant to hold your value in the first place. Letting someone else go ahead of you might seem like nothing. But if you pay attention to the reaction in your body when it happens, you'll realize that moment is loaded. And how you respond tells you more about your emotional maturity than almost anything else. So the next time you feel the impulse to pass, to interrupt, to squeeze ahead, to win the moment, pause and ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I let someone else go first? Because the answer to that question, that's the edge of your growth, and that's where the real work begins.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.